Hollywood had seen many love stories, but few shined as brightly as Margot Robbie and Tom Ackerley. They were more than just a couple, they were a partnership. A love that thrived away from flashing lights and ruthless headlines. Together, they built a life of quiet stability in an industry where love was fleeting. To the world, their marriage was the exception, the proof that true love could survive in the chaos of stardom. But every perfect story has a turning point. And for them, it came the moment Brad Pitt entered the picture. The film was supposed to be just another collaboration, another star-studded blockbuster where talent and charisma collided on screen. Margot and Brad had worked together before, shared red carpets, exchanged pleasantries at glamorous events. But this time, something was different. Something unspoken. It wasn't obvious at first. It never is. The long hours on set blurred into late-night rehearsals. Scenes that demanded tension, passion, raw emotion. At first, it was just the nature of the job, two professionals committed to their craft. But soon, the energy between them became impossible to ignore. The stolen glances. The effortless laughter. The kind of connection that lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. And then, the shift happened. What started as casual conversations turned into something deeper. A magnetic pull that neither of them acknowledged, but both felt. The way she leaned in when he spoke. The way he studied her expressions, as if trying to decode something unspoken. The way they both stayed behind on set long after everyone else had left. For Tom Ackerley, the change was subtle at first. Margot was the same woman he had always known, kind, dedicated, loving. But there were moments now, moments where she seemed distracted. Her phone lit up more often, her mind elsewhere. And then, there was the night he saw her staring at a message on her screen, her expression unreadable. One text. One moment. That was all it took. He didn't ask. Not yet. But deep down, he already knew. Something had shifted between them. And in Hollywood, once a spark ignites, it's only a matter of time before it turns into a wildfire. Something had changed. Tom Ackerley could feel it before he could prove it. A shift so subtle that, at first, he convinced himself it was nothing. Margot was busy, exhausted, caught up in the demands of filming. But excuses could only mask the truth for so long. Her phone was always close now, never left on the kitchen counter, never face up on the table. The easy, late-night conversations they used to have had been replaced by silence. She was there, but somewhere else entirely. And then, the late nights started. At first, they were expected. Big-budget films demanded time, reshoots, press obligations, endless rehearsals. But this was different. She wasn't just working late. She was staying late. Hours passed after everyone else had left, but she remained. And always, so did Brad. Hollywood had a way of protecting its secrets. On-set whispers never reached the outside world. But Tom wasn't an outsider. He saw the way Margot's expressions had changed. The way she came home too tired to talk, but too restless to sleep. And then, there was the perfume. Margot's perfume was distinct, light, floral, familiar. But one night, when she slipped quietly into bed long after midnight, there was something different. A scent that didn't belong to her. Something heavier. Something masculine. It was fleeting, just a trace. But it was enough. Tom didn't say anything. Not yet. He simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. And in that moment, the truth settled over him like a weight he could no longer ignore. This wasn't just exhaustion. This wasn't just work. Something was slipping away from him. And it all began with Brad Pitt. Doubt had a way of creeping in, slow at first, then all at once. Tom Ackerley had always trusted Margot. Their relationship wasn't built on Hollywood superficiality, it was real, grounded in years of friendship before love. He had never been the jealous type, never the kind of man to snoop through messages or track late-night whereabouts. But something was different now. Margot wasn't just distant, she was distracted. Not in the way that happened after a long shoot, when exhaustion pulled her into silence. This was something else. There were moments, fleeting, but impossible to ignore, where she seemed almost guilty. Like the time he walked into the room, and she locked her phone before looking up. Like the nervous laugh that slipped out when he asked about her night. Like the way her hands fidgeted when she mentioned Brad's name, as if even she didn't believe her own words. Tom tried to push the thoughts away. He told himself he was imagining things. But suspicion had a way of digging in and refusing to let go. And then, it happened. One night, after Margot had gone to bed, Tom walked into the kitchen for a glass of water. Her phone sat on the counter, screen dark, notifications silent. She never left it unattended anymore. But tonight, she had. He told himself he wouldn't look. He shouldn't look. But then it buzzed. Once. Twice. And there it was, Brad Pitt. His name, right there on the screen. Tom's chest tightened. His fingers hovered over the phone, heart pounding. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to open it, to see the truth that he already felt in his gut. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped back, hands clenched into fists, his breath slow and measured. If he opened that message, there would be no turning back. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He waited. The next morning, Margot woke up to find him in the kitchen, coffee made, eyes dark with exhaustion. He didn't mention the phone. He didn't mention Brad. But when she kissed him goodbye and walked out the door, Tom Ackerley made a decision. He was going to find out the truth. No more doubts. No more blind trust. This wasn't just his wife. This wasn't just his marriage. This was his entire world. And if Brad Pitt had come to take it from him, Tom Ackerley wasn't going to let him win. Tom Ackerley had always been a rational man. Logical. Level-headed. He had built a life on trust, on believing in the foundation he and Margot had spent years creating. But trust only worked when both people were playing by the same rules. And now? Now, something was off. The signs weren't just whispers in the back of his mind anymore. They were screaming at him. Margot's absences grew longer. The excuses felt thinner. And Brad Pitt's name lingered in conversations like an unwelcome guest. Tom knew he could ask her outright. Demand answers. But Hollywood was a game of image, control, and illusion. People didn't get caught unless they slipped up. And Margot Robbie never slipped up. So, he made a choice. A choice he never imagined himself making. He was going to watch. Listen. Follow the clues. If something was happening, if Margot was hiding something with Brad Pitt, then he would see it with his own eyes. That night, after Margot fell asleep, Tom sat alone in their dimly lit living room, his laptop open. He didn't hire a private investigator. Not yet. Instead, he dug through the schedules. Filming times. Set locations. Press events. He traced Margot's movements, looking for inconsistencies. And there it was. A single detail that changed everything. Margot had told him she was flying to New York in 2 days for a last-minute industry event. But according to the schedule, Brad Pitt would be there too. It could have been a coincidence. A simple overlap. But Tom didn't believe in coincidences anymore. His jaw tightened. His pulse drummed in his ears. This wasn't just a gut feeling anymore. This was proof. Margot wasn't just working late. She was lying. And now, Tom Ackerley was done waiting. The suitcase was small. Just enough for one night. Tom Ackerley wasn't thinking about consequences anymore. He had a choice: stay home and pretend everything was fine, or find out the truth for himself. Margot had left for New York that morning, alone. Or so she said. Brad Pitt was already there. Coincidence? Maybe. But Tom didn't believe in coincidences anymore. The flight was quiet, filled with businessmen and exhausted travelers. But Tom couldn't sit still. His mind was racing, playing out every possible scenario. Would she be at the hotel alone? Would she lie to his face? Would he see something he couldn't unsee? And the worst thought, the one that had been eating away at him for days. What if she wasn't even hiding it anymore? New York was cold when he landed. The air sharp, the streets too alive, too loud. He barely noticed. His cab pulled up to the Mercer, one of the most exclusive hotels in Soho. The kind of place where celebrities could disappear behind tinted glass and no one would ask questions. Margot was staying here. And so was Brad. Tom stepped into the lobby, hands clenched at his sides. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. But then, there she was. Not on a movie set. Not at a press event. Margot. In the dim light of the hotel bar, she was laughing. And across from her, leaning in just a little too close, his gaze locked onto hers. Brad Pitt. For a second, Tom couldn't move. The world blurred at the edges. Margot had no idea he was watching. And Brad? Brad looked at her like she was already his. Tom Ackerley stood frozen in the dimly lit hotel bar, his body tense, unblinking, unbreathing. Across the room, Margot laughed. It was the kind of laugh he hadn't heard in weeks. The kind that used to be reserved just for him. But tonight, she wasn't laughing with him. She was laughing with Brad Pitt. Tom had imagined this moment 100 different ways. If he caught her, would she look guilty? Would she look afraid? Would she look ashamed? But as she tilted her head, leaning in closer, she didn't look guilty at all. That was what broke him. Not the secrecy. Not the lies. The comfort. The way she sat there, in public, like there was nothing to hide. Tom moved before he could stop himself. Slow steps. Purposeful. Dangerous. And then, Margot turned. The moment her eyes locked onto his, the world stopped. For the first time in their entire relationship, Tom saw fear in her face. Not shock. Not confusion. Fear. Brad noticed her reaction and followed her gaze. His expression didn't change. He didn't even look surprised. If anything, he looked prepared. Tom's fists clenched. His heart slammed against his ribs. Had Brad known this would happen? Had he wanted it? Margot opened her mouth, as if to speak, as if there was anything she could say that would fix this. But Tom didn't give her the chance. He turned and walked away. Margot jumped from her seat. A chair scraped against the floor. Footsteps rushed behind him. Tom. But he didn't stop. Not this time. Tom pushed through the revolving doors of the hotel, stepping out into the cold New York air. His breath was unsteady, his hands clenched into fists so tight his nails dug into his palms. He didn't stop walking. Didn't want to. He needed distance, from her, from Brad, from everything. But behind him, he heard her. Margot's footsteps were quick, desperate, the sound of heels striking pavement. She was chasing him. He kept moving. "Tom, please, just stop." The words cracked, half-broken already. But he wasn't ready to hear her voice. Not after what he had just seen. Not after watching her sit across from Brad Pitt, smiling, laughing, looking at him like he was the only person in the world. Margot caught up, reaching for his arm. He pulled away, his body stiff, his pulse hammering against his ribs. "Let me explain," she said, breathless, her eyes searching his face. But what was there to explain? The late nights? The secret messages? The way she had looked at him every time he questioned her, pretending like nothing was wrong? The moment stretched between them, thick with words neither of them could say. Finally, Tom exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Explain what?" His voice was low, measured, dangerously calm. "That you lied? That you came here alone, but somehow Brad Pitt ended up sitting across from you, like this was just normal?" Margot flinched, like she had been slapped. "It's not what you think," she whispered. Tom let out a short, humorless laugh. "Right. Of course, it's not. Because nothing ever is, Margot. Not when you're the one telling the story." Her face crumpled. "That's not fair." He took a step back, shaking his head. He had loved her. He had trusted her. He had never once questioned her loyalty. But now, standing in the middle of a freezing New York street, with the image of her and Brad burned into his mind, he felt like a fool. "You should go back inside," he said. His voice wasn't angry, it was tired. Defeated. "I'm sure Brad is waiting for you." Margot's eyes widened in horror, but she didn't deny it. And that was all he needed to know. Tom turned and walked away. He didn't stop this time. And Margot? She didn't chase him. Tom didn't stop walking until the sounds of the city swallowed everything else. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he couldn't be near her. His phone buzzed. Once. Twice. Again. "Margot." He didn't answer. Not now. Maybe not ever. The hotel, the bar, the way she had looked at Brad, it all replayed in his mind like a film reel he couldn't stop. She hadn't even denied it. She had stood there, guilty, caught, and speechless. Maybe that was the worst part. She had no excuse to give. He finally stopped walking when he reached an empty side street, leaning against the wall of a building. His chest felt tight, his breath sharp. He wasn't angry. Anger would have been easier. This was grief. Because whatever had happened between Margot and Brad, whether it had already gone too far or was on the verge of it, it meant the thing he had trusted the most in his life was suddenly a lie. His phone buzzed again. A text. He hesitated. Then, finally, he looked. "Margot, Tom, please come back. Please talk to me." His grip tightened around the phone. Not a denial. Not an explanation. Just a plea. His thumb hovered over the screen. And then? He turned it off. He didn't want to hear her voice. Didn't want to read her words. Because what was left to say? In the end, silence was the only answer she was getting. And for the first time since this started, Tom Ackerley realized. Maybe he wasn't going to forgive her. The first night without him was the hardest. Margot sat in the hotel suite, staring at the untouched glass of wine on the table, the city lights flickering against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything was too quiet, too still. There had always been a comforting rhythm in her life with Tom, his presence, his laughter, the way he made even the smallest moments feel like home. But now, there was only emptiness. He was gone. And worse, he hadn't even given her a chance to explain. Margot reached for her phone, but the last text she had sent still sat there, unread. No response. No calls. Nothing. It was like he had vanished, disappeared into the city, erasing himself from her world before she even had the chance to fix it. She told herself he just needed time. He would come back. He always did. But something about this time felt different. By morning, the news had already spread. Her phone buzzed with messages, not from Tom, but from agents, publicists, mutual friends, all sending vague, carefully worded questions. Something was wrong, they could feel it. There had been whispers, rumors, speculation. People had seen Tom leaving the hotel alone. Someone had recognized the tension in the bar. Hollywood was a town built on stories. And now? She had become one. But it wasn't until the afternoon that the real blow came. Her manager sent her a link. No context. No warning. Just the headline staring back at her like a loaded gun. Margot Robbie and Brad Pitt, private NYC meeting sparks cheating scandal. Her blood ran cold. The article was filled with speculation, claims that she and Brad had been spotted in deep conversation at the hotel, sources saying Tom had been visibly upset when he left. There were no hard facts, no proof. But in Hollywood, facts weren't necessary. The perception was enough. Margot's hands trembled as she scrolled down. And then, at the very bottom, she saw something that nearly stopped her heart. A quote. A direct source. And it wasn't just any source. It was Tom. He had spoken. Broken his silence. Given them something to print. And what he had said? It destroyed her. Margot's hands tightened around the phone as she read the quote over and over, her vision blurring. Tom had spoken. For days, she had begged for a response, anything that would tell her where he was, what he was thinking. He had given her nothing. Until now. And instead of answering her, he had answered the press. The quote was short, just enough to send the entire industry into a frenzy. I'm not surprised. You never really know someone until you do. 12 words. That was all. 12 words that turned a whisper into a firestorm. Margot felt her stomach drop as she scrolled through the comments flooding in, each one worse than the last. Wow. If Tom Ackerley is saying that, you know something shady happened. The fact that he isn't denying it says everything. She really fumbled the most low-key, supportive husband for Brad Pitt? Her face burned. The internet had made up its mind. The story wasn't just gossip anymore. It was truth. Not because it was real, but because Tom hadn't denied it. And now, she was the villain. By the time she looked up from the screen, the damage was already done. Calls were coming in. Emails. Messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years, pretending to care but really just fishing for details. But there was one name she didn't see. Brad. For the first time since this all started, she realized, he hadn't reached out. Margot grabbed her phone, scrolling through their last conversation. No new messages. No missed calls. Panic twisted in her chest. Brad had been right there with her, sitting across from her in that hotel bar. But now that the world was turning against her, where was he? Something about the silence felt off. Then, finally, her phone buzzed. Not a text. Not a call. A headline. Margot felt the blood drain from her face as she read the words. Brad Pitt breaks his silence, this is not my mess. She exhaled sharply, clicking the article with shaking hands. And then, she felt the ground shift beneath her. Because Brad hadn't defended her. He hadn't denied the rumors. He had distanced himself completely. As if he had never been involved at all. As if she was the only one left to take the fall. Margot's world was imploding. The industry had turned on her overnight. Studios, brands, executives, people who once called her a Hollywood darling, were now whispering behind closed doors. No one cared about the truth. They only cared about the story. And the story was clear: Tom had left. Brad had stepped back. Margot was standing in the wreckage, alone. For the first time in her career, the phone calls weren't about new projects or magazine covers. Now, they were about damage control. Her publicist's voice was tense when they spoke. The strategy was simple: stay quiet. Avoid the press. Don't add fuel to the fire. But Margot wasn't stupid. She had seen this happen before. Hollywood loved to build people up, but it loved tearing them down even more. And now, the same people who had worshipped her, celebrated her, cheered for her, they were watching her drown. There was only one person who could stop this. Tom. Margot's hands trembled as she dialed his number. It rang. And rang. Then, voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. The panic clawed at her throat. He wasn't just ignoring her. He was erasing her. And the realization hit like ice water in her veins. Tom Ackerley wasn't coming back. Margot stopped sleeping. Every night blurred into the next, endless hours of scrolling through news alerts, PR emails, and the comments that refused to stop. She deserves this. I always knew she was fake. Where's Brad now? That was the part that stung the most. Brad had left her to burn alone. No calls, no texts, nothing. And Tom? Gone. It was like she had never even been in his life. Like their marriage had been erased in real time. Then, one evening, her phone rang. An unknown number. Her heart jumped. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than shame. What if it was Tom? What if? She answered. And the voice on the other end was not Tom. It was someone she hadn't spoken to in years. Someone who had once been her whole world. The words were simple, calm, deliberate. I heard what happened. I think we should talk. Margot's breath hitched. Because the man on the other end of the line was Leonardo DiCaprio. Margot stared at the phone screen long after the call ended, her mind racing. Leonardo DiCaprio. She hadn't spoken to him in years. Not since those early days in Hollywood when she was still the fresh-faced actress with everything to prove, and he was, well, Leonardo DiCaprio. They had worked together. Flirted, maybe. But nothing serious. Now, out of nowhere, he was reaching out. Why? The world already saw her as Hollywood's latest cautionary tale. The press had painted her as the woman who destroyed her own marriage. The studios had stopped calling. And yet, here he was. Margot hesitated for hours before texting him back. A simple response. Where are you? His reply came within seconds. Paris. It was too much. Too sudden. A distraction she knew she shouldn't take. But what was left for her here? She was already exiled from the industry she once ruled. The city had turned its back on her. And Tom? Tom was never coming home. She booked the flight at midnight. When Margot landed in Paris the next evening, a private car was already waiting. No paparazzi. No reporters. Leo had made sure of that. He wasn't reckless like Brad. He was controlled. Calculated. He had spent his entire career avoiding scandals, staying one step ahead of the media's obsession with him. And now? He had invited her into his world. She barely had time to react before Leo leaned back in his chair, his voice low. "It's already started," he murmured. Margot didn't know if he meant the comeback. Or the war. Margot's fingers tightened around the edge of the glass. She couldn't breathe. Tom's message burned into her mind, 3 simple words that carried a weight she couldn't comprehend. "Tell her I know." Know what? That she was in Paris? That she was sitting across from Leonardo DiCaprio, contemplating the most reckless decision of her life? Or was it something worse? Leo watched her carefully, his smirk never fading. He didn't seem rattled, because he never was. "Whatever you're thinking, stop," he said finally, voice smooth as ever. "Tom isn't here. He's not coming." But Margot knew Leo well enough to hear what he wasn't saying. Tom wasn't coming to Paris. Because Tom had already been here. The realization hit like ice water. Something was wrong. Very wrong. She grabbed her phone, ignoring Leo's sharp gaze, and scrolled through her texts. Tom had blocked her. That wasn't what scared her. What scared her was what she found next. A leaked video. Not on a gossip site. Not in the tabloids. But on a private server. She clicked it, her heart hammering in her chest. The screen flickered to life. Security footage. A hotel hallway. Her hotel hallway. In New York. The timestamp was from the night Tom left. And then, the footage changed. A man's silhouette appeared, stepping out of a room down the hall. He moved cautiously, glancing both ways before pulling his hood over his face. Margot's stomach twisted. Because she knew exactly who it was. Brad Pitt. Not leaving the bar. Leaving her room. The glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the marble floor. Leo didn't react. He already knew. Margot shook her head, her mind reeling. No. It wasn't possible. She had gone to sleep alone that night. Hadn't she? A cold wave of nausea hit her. Had she? Memories flickered, fuzzy, distorted, broken. The way the hotel staff had handed her a second keycard earlier that day. The way she had barely touched her drink at the bar. The way the entire night blurred after a certain point. Her hands trembled. Because if the footage was real, if Brad had been in her room, then Tom hadn't left because of what he saw at the bar. He had left because of this. A truth she didn't even know herself. The walls of Leo's chateau suddenly felt too small. Too suffocating. Like a trap she had walked into without realizing it. Leo exhaled, finally pushing back his chair. "Now you understand," he said simply. Margot's voice barely worked. "Understand what?" He smiled. "Why Tom won't ever forgive you." Silence stretched between them, heavy and final. Margot felt the weight of everything collapsing at once. The career. The marriage. The lie that had ruined it all. Because Brad had betrayed her. And Tom? Tom had already made his final move. A single news alert popped onto her screen. Tom Ackerley files for divorce. The marriage died long before the scandal. Margot let out a shaky breath. It was over. But the worst part? She still didn't know the full truth. And maybe she never would.